fully constructed by black people. I mean, the masonry is so striking. And so the possibilities there are really endless when we think about that moment when we had very usable skills that could not just intellectual skills, but also manual skills, okay? Teachers, I should say, also were some of the earliest civil rights activists. Many of you already know this. And so teachers were out there leading the cause for that moment of civil rights struggle, which began in that century. Well, it didn't really begin in that century, but that's when we started to, really grapple with segregation and these ideas of separate versus integration. In addition to that, black educational institutions in this moment transformed American education. I already kind of talked to you about public schools and how Southern public schools owe a great debt to African Americans, but African Americans taught educational activists from then all the way to the present about collectivism, how to pool your resources, how to make a lot out of a very little. It was a sad lesson, but they learned to operate schools, without state assistance, because before the state started assisting black schools, particularly the land grant institutions, African Americans had to fill in all those gaps. In addition to that, education transformed, or black education transformed access to all. I just said that. It opened the door a little bit wider for women to get education. As I said, the PWIs had very strict gender guidelines, with the exception of schools like Vassar and others. But African Americans saw, with that image I showed you, it was full and equal education for all. Women weren't just relegated to, cooking. They had a full access to a full, robust education. African Americans taught our federal government that education itself was a state right of citizenship. So as a citizen of this country, you should have a right to an education. And that hadn't ever before been pushed in our society. So that's another important and noteworthy gain. And then I want to pivot now to some black teaching giants in the little bit of time I have left. Do you all know of any black educators outside of Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, which is a little bit later? You know of any black educators in this period?
Well, Mary McLeod Bethune.
Okay, that's a little bit later.
Later, okay.
Yeah, she's in the 20th century.
I don't know if it's during that time, it might be later, the woman who founded the Palmer Institute, is that
Yes,
later?
yes. Okay, anybody else? And so the silences here kind of reveal that historians haven't done enough, right? So there's a big gap in the literature. Even when I was preparing this, I said, wow, there's just not enough. I should have just been bombarded with names, but it just goes to show you that the historical literature written by professors of history hasn't done enough work in this particular era. But I'll start with Francis Louis Cardozo. Some of you recognize the name now that I put it up there in the person. And so Cardozo was a free man, highly educated, more than most of other teachers in his day. He went to the University of Glasgow, which then and now is one of the world's top institutions. He studied theology in Edinburgh after that, and also in London. He became a principal of a black school in Charlotte, the Avery Institute, and he was one of the most highly recognizable and distinguished black teachers of this Reconstruction period. Although one of the sad things about Cardozo is that he started to gear his school towards the black elite. And so he was less interested in teaching to the masses, or the masses were free people at the time, and he wanted to specifically teach those who had been free before the Civil War, the light-skinned elite of Charleston. And so he went on, though, to become the first African-American in the country to be elected to state office, and so I emphasize the word elected, and he served as South Carolina Secretary of State and then the treasurer for the state of South Carolina. Charlotte Fortin. Another recognizable name? Yeah. She's the daughter of a black abolitionist. She moved from Philadelphia to the Sea Islands, the Gullah Sea Islands, as many of us all recognize. She taught students there not just reading and writing, but Black history, one of my personal favorites, obviously. She wrote in her journal, this is from one of her journal entries, she said, "Talk to the children a little today about the noble Toussaint." That's Toussaint Louverture, that's like radical, right? She said, "They listen very attentively. It is well that they should know that one of their color could do this for his race. I long to inspire them with courage and ambition of a noble sort and high purpose." So that was Charlotte Fortin. Somebody I didn't have on there was Vivian C. Green. And she set up a school in Davis Bend, Mississippi, where she taught about 120 children. Many of you complain because you have classes of 40. So imagine 120, all of them with different levels of knowledge when they come into the door. But she said that she looked forward to the time when her people could be strong, blessed with education, purified, and made more prosperous. And one of my favorite, Mary Peak. That's for the Hamptonians in the room. Mary Peak was born in Norfolk, Virginia. She was educated not far from here in Alexandria. In 1847, she moved to Hampton, Virginia, and she began teaching African American children from her home. She, in addition to being a teacher, she also was a critical part of founding the Daughters of Zion, the mutual aid society that helped provide aid for the poor. When her home and other African American homes were destroyed during the Civil War, those families moved to Fort Monroe. In 1861, Mary Peak held classes under the Emancipation Oak, and the tree is up there. It still exists to this day. I mean, when you see it, it'll send chills down your spine. So Hampton University's history started under that tree. And so about a year ago, the state of Virginia was going to bulldoze the tree to make the highway bigger. And black Hamptonians organized and would have no parts of it. So there's still a lot of educational activism outside of schools.
Was anyone ever hung from that tree?
I don't think so. Yeah, but I don't know the history of that tree, but it looks like one of those hanging trees. But I think because it was within that institution, they protected that tree, and they still do to this very day. The fact that it's had this long history speaks to the great care and caretaking of history with that tree as one of the objects of that history. And so she started under that tree September 17th, 1861, with only a half a dozen pupils initially, but within several days she had between 50 and 60 students. Adults were begging her to learn, and she organized night classes in addition. Unfortunately, Mary Peak died of tuberculosis shortly thereafter, but her legacy lives on to this very day. Another black woman, critical education, Susie King Taylor. Many of you recognize her. She's the only black woman in history to write memoirs about her experiences during the Civil War. And Susie King Taylor had been born in slavery in Savannah, Georgia in 1848. She was actually educated in secret schools that were held during slavery. So she got educated while enslaved, which is very rare. She escaped from her owners during the Civil War, and she attached herself to a black regiment of the United States Colored Troops called the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, and she married a man from that unit. And she began teaching the men of that unit during the Civil War. So we owe a great debt to her as well. Then there's William Hooper Council. William Hooper Council was born into slavery on the Council plantation in 1849 in North Carolina. He attended a school opened by Quakers for about just 3 years, and this speaks to what I said earlier about a lot of times the teachers didn't have that much more education than their students. He opened a school within 3 years of education. when he was 22, and then he also went to night school himself. At the age of 26, the Alabama legislature appointed him to be principal of their own land-grant normal school for African Americans. It would later become Alabama A&M. So he was the first black president, William Cooper Council. And then the last one, and this is just a snapshot. This is my guy, Peter Humphreys Clark. That's my second book. And he was a principal in Ohio, although we don't necessarily think about the Midwest as part of the Reconstruction period, but there was a lot of reconstructing that had to be done in the Midwest as well. And so he became the principal of the first black public high school in the country, John I. Gaines High School. Unfortunately, Dunbar takes that claim far too often than it deserves. But it was actually John I. Gaines High School in 1866, which preceded Dunbar, or the M Street School, by about 4 years. So he was a principal there, and he also went to become the principal of Alabama A&M when they threw Counsell out after his civil rights activism. So he served there 1 year, and then he moved on to St. Louis as a principal of one of the last black schools in St. Louis, because as time marches on, those black schools start to become more integrated. I should say too that the dark side, this is the ugly underbelly of these phenomenal teachers. I already gave you some little bit of insight when I talked about Cardozo. Counsell as well had a troubling past as it relates to just things that we just wish they hadn't done, I guess. You know? And so I'll say that Counsell filed a lawsuit in 1887 against the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, right? Because they had train conductors had thrown him off out of his first class train car. And he had purchased a ticket, so he filed a lawsuit. Like, I purchased a ticket in the first class train, and you threw me out. Where Alabama A&M, the officials that ran that school, actually fired him for his civil rights activism, and that's when Peter Clark from Ohio came down to take his place. He was reappointed the next year, but I'll say that one of the things that Counsell said, he said in a 1901 open letter, and this is the troubling part, it's not just Booker T. He says, do not, and this is an open letter to whites, 1901, do not misunderstand me. For God's sake, do not misinterpret me or misrepresent me. I have never asked for suffrage. Since a majority of the better elements of the white people of Alabama wanted the new Constitution and promised better things under it, I was not against it. I am opposed to every phase of social equality so distasteful to us both, and in my opinion, detrimental to Southern society. There is no necessity for it, meaning for equality. Maybe you shouldn't tell your students that part. And so that's one of the things that in order to keep their schools afloat, like Booker T. Washington and even William Hooper Council, many of them kind of kowtowed to that Southern racism and all of that. And it's very disappointing, but nonetheless, we have to expose it. And so the last thing, the legacy, a lot of these teachers, you know, many of them were also ministers. They went on to establish so many black newspapers in this period. And so in addition to that, many of them ran for political office, and many of them wrote actual books. And so we're starting to see just a surgence of black books and black writers in this period, many of them who had been educated in these HBCUs and other schools. We also have a lot of them filed the first civil rights cases in that era. A lot of them came from teachers, just like Ida B. Wells and William Hooper Council. As far as the end, how do we periodize educational reconstruction if we believe what I demonstrated that it is a thing? What's the end of it? Well, I would suggest that the end of the educational moment during the Reconstruction era, or educational reconstruction, it began to, the ending was in the 1880s. That's when you start to see the end. And that's when states were refusing to fund these schools equally. And black people went from just desiring the right to go to school to desiring equal education, right? At least equal funding. And so they're starting to really talk about that in their newspapers and other things. The culmination of the period, the decided blow, was Plessy versus Ferguson, which African Americans knew far quicker than most people that separate was inherently unequal. And so some of the sources are there. Thank you for your time. Are there any questions?